إن الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا. من يهده الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له، وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له، وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله. أما بعد. In the previous lecture, we summed up the basic objections of Ahl Sunnah against Ibn Sina's Burhan and the Greek methodology of metaphysical theory and argumentation employed in that argument, showing briefly the entailments that follow from its basic categorization of existing things and from the premises that rely on that categorization. In this lecture, we will investigate the bulk of chapter 1 in Hijab's book, with special attention to the way he tries to incorporate that argument with modern debates, especially with neo-atheistic opponents. Now, on page 10, Hijab starts his introduction of Ibn Sina's metaphysics. He says, in the pointers and reminders, Ibn Sina starts off with classification of that which is possible or contingent, muhal or impossible, like a square circle, and necessary. On a similar note, in his metaphysics, Ibn Sina moves on to speaking directly of the modal specialties of the necessary existence. As for the necessary existence, it has no cause. This is because if it had a cause, its existence would be because of it. Anything which is considered essentially by itself and its existence is not necessary in itself cannot be a necessary existence. So it has been made clear that a necessary existence is uncaused. As a corollary to this, it is not possible that a thing is a necessary existence in and of itself and also because of another thing. Moreover, regarding anything that is a contingent existence in essence, both its existence or non-existence would come about because of a cause. This is because if the contingent thing can be located, then its existence can be discerned from nothingness or lack of its existence. And if it is not in existence, then its non-existence would be discernible from its existence. So an exhaustive rendering of the options would suggest that its existence or lack of existence would either be caused because of something else or not. If it is from something else, then that something else is the cause of it, and if it is not from something else, then it is itself the necessary existence. Now, first of all, let's start by pointing out that this passage is not merely an attempt to define the two notions of necessity and contingency in existing things, as is common in any disciplinary terminology. If I were to define the two terms, I would simply say a necessary being is one that has existed from eternity without a cause, whereas a contingent thing is anything that started to exist following a cause. As I elaborated elsewhere, and as Ibn Taymiyyah rahimahullah explained in his lengthy criticism of Ibn Sina في درء التعارض and other treatises, it should suffice in destroying and ridiculing an atheist's claim that he sees no reason to believe that he was ever created, to show the absurdity of the idea of something coming from nothing in terms of causation. It stands perfectly clear that if I must have had a cause for my own existence, since it's absurd to claim otherwise, then it couldn't have been me who caused it, because nothing can cause itself to be. So either that cause needed yet another cause before it, or it didn't. If it did not, then that's the uncaused, uncreated creator that we Muslims believe in. And if it did need yet another cause to be, then the causation must inevitably end at an uncreated, uncaused creator, because otherwise an absurd infinite regress would defeat the entire notion of causation altogether. Alright? This, brothers and sisters, is the only reasonable manner that we Ahl Sunnah, Ahl Athar should employ the notions of contingency and necessity as previously defined. The only manner by which we should employ those notions. The thrust of the argument, as you can see, is simply in showing the sheer absurdity and contradiction inherent in an atheist's claim that no willful, masterful, eternal creator is required for him to begin to exist as he did. Now pay attention here, brothers and sisters, because this investigation of the rationale should hopefully explain the profound methodological difference between the ways of Ahl Sunnah and Ibn Taymiyyah on one hand, and the ways of philosophers and mutakallimin on the other, in addressing self-proclaimed atheists and skeptics. Obviously, the tone and mannerism of the argument is not propositional, in the sense that we are asking the opponent to accept our proposal of theoretical reasons for believing that our position is the truth. We're not proposing anything when we advance an argument in that manner. It's not the epistemology of establishing a previously unknown or an otherwise unattained belief, brothers and sisters. That's not what we're doing. We're rather exposing the sheer absurdity of the opposing position. It's like saying, are you seriously asking us to provide to provide you with theoretical reasons to believe that you were indeed created by a creator who could have otherwise chosen not to make you, or to make you in an entirely different image, for example? Can't you see the absurdities entailed by even as much as suggesting otherwise? Okay, this is the exact same tone that you find in the Quran when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala exclaims in purely rhetorical questions, أم خلقوا من غير شيء أم هم الخالقون أم خلقوا السماوات والأرض بل لا يوقنون. Okay, بل لا يوقنون. See, that's why it's reprimanding them. Okay, or have they been created by nothing, or have they created themselves, or have they created the heavens and the earth? Nah, they know no certainty. Okay, now obviously the argument employs the necessarily existing knowledge in the people addressed with it of the following, all the following facts. 1. The self-evident fact that they couldn't have come from no cause or originator. 2. The equally self-evident fact that they couldn't have created themselves or caused themselves to be. 3. The equally self-evident fact that the world in its entirety has been created just the same. And 4. The self-evident fact that none of them could have been the one that created that world, or that created all things. Okay, obviously. All these 4 facts, the argument as presented in the Quran relies in them being quite clear enough, being self-evident. Okay, what does it employ them for? To establish the knowledge that some abstract being must have been the necessary cause of all contingent things? No. The fact that they have been created by an entity worthy of all praise and all worship is just as self-evidently clear as each of those 4 facts, if not more so. Okay, actually it is in fact more so. The argument thus works by showing atheists and skeptics how shockingly absurd all possible entailments of their position are. That's what it does. That's how it proceeds in muhajaja. Okay, it works by bringing forth to their mind's eye what other self-evident facts they would have to deny if they insisted that they have no reason to believe they were ever created. That's how it works. So by no means is this to be considered a theoretical proposition in the Greek manner adopted by the philosophers and the mutakallimin alike in this issue. Brothers and sisters, a propositional argument is by definition one that is advanced between 2 peers under the implicit agreement or assumption that it could be shown to be false just as well as it could be shown to be true in theoretical terms. Okay, hence the notion of a proposition. You're just merely proposing that you know what you know to be true. Okay, this argument, however, is nothing like that. It's rather a reprimanding rhetoric that seeks to bring about the well-earned disdain and duly deserved ridicule for the opposing situation, making its absurdity as clear as day. That's what the Quran does in this manner. Okay, what Ibn Sina did in that passage, however, that passage that Hijab quoted, was not to merely define contingent existence and necessary existence as meanings that by necessity apply only to creatures and their one and only creator, by virtue of the rational necessity we outlined earlier. He did not attempt to refute the denial of this fact by showing how ridiculous and absurd the entailments of denying it would be, as we did. No. Rather, he endeavored to establish by means of metaphysical theory and metaphysical definition, al-hadd al-falsafi, the epistemic warrant for that very fact itself. According to that Greek epistemology, it would not suffice for the philosopher to define a necessary being as we defined it previously, and then just assert that it can only be the creator of all things, the source of all that exists besides himself or other than himself. In their Greek sophistry, the opponent would insist that it is not clear to them that all creatures are indeed contingent, i.e. the entire world, and that there can only be one being whose existence is the necessary cause for all else that exists. So Ibn Sina sets out to furnish a metaphysical categorization of what counts as a contingent being or a contingent thing or a contingent existence, and what counts as a necessary being, in a manner that he wishes would convince the opponent that some necessary being should in fact exist at all, given the way that all contingent things are like in terms of their natures and their attributes. So he finds that he needs to say, as translated by Hijab here, moreover, regarding anything that is a contingent existence in essence, both its existence or non-existence would come about because of a cause. This is because if the contingent thing can be located, then its existence can be discerned from nothingness or lack of its existence, and if it is not in existence, then its non-existence would be discernible from its existence. Okay, but do we normal, reasonable people actually need to be told that if something can be located, then its existence can be discerned from non-existence? Obviously not. So why did he feel he needed to make such a note? Okay, because a philosopher trained on that tradition would still not find any reason to believe that all things of this world are indeed contingent according to that definition Ibn Sina is putting forth. How, they would counter, is in sheer sophistry, of course, are we expected to associate that concept, contingency, with things of this world, not to mention the entirety of the world as it stands? How can we tell that something is indeed contingent and thus take those particular properties and attributes that we can assert by observation as definitive of what contingent things are like in general? Okay, only by doing so, by establishing some metaphysical analogy on the exact nature of contingent and necessary things, would an opponent following that tradition even consider the argument as rational at all. Okay, those are the rules of the game as invented by the fathers of the academy, and unless you follow it faithfully, you're neither here nor there. Okay, the proposition is, at the end of the day, an analogy of some sort. The propositional argument is an analogy, eventually. A metaphysical analogy. It might be purely deductive, قياس شمول محض, or both deductive and inductive in nature. I mean, if you have the premise that is, when we have a premise that is inductive, but it is an analogy nonetheless, okay? You start by establishing certain common attributes of existing things, categorizing them as you do, and then deduce by analogy that the being you seek to prove must exist by virtue of that classification as part of one of those classes of existence. Its existence can only be merited or justified as such, okay, under that classification. So here Ibn Sina characterizes contingent things as those things that can be located in the world. If you can indeed say about something that it exists here or there, then it satisfies his definition of contingent existence. Why? Because if it can either be here or there, then its being somewhere at all is not necessary, meaning that it can only be conceived of as being there, and thus it can only be a contingent being. Okay? It can only be conceived as being there, and thus it can only be a contingent being. It contingent because only because of a cause that it was there rather than elsewhere. All right? Is this not the case with all things we see around us? Can we claim that we've ever observed in this world something that can only be where we see it by rational necessity and not somewhere else instead? Obviously not. So he hints that things of this world are all contingent because we cannot possibly think of them as being located where they are by necessity. No. Okay, if they are located somewhere, then we can assert that they exist and that they are contingent. Okay, being where they are rather than elsewhere. Okay, but obviously making it a property of contingent things as opposed to necessary things that they can be located implies that the necessary being you seek to prove from that such dichotomy you're establishing here cannot be located at all. Okay. Now pay attention, brothers and sisters. It cannot be located at all. Thus, to be a necessary thing or a necessary being would mean automatically getting stripped from the property of being in place or any attribute that falls under that meaning, in principle, categorically. Okay. Notice that he makes the property of being located a criterion for determining that a contingent being exists at all. It is located because of a cause that brought it into being and brought it into being there, where it is. Okay, now, I suspect that at this point, someone might counter that this is not what Ibn Sina meant. He only intended to show or demonstrate that contingent things are those that have been caused to be in this or that location, when in fact we can imagine them not being anywhere at all. Or in other words, non-existent. Okay, and to that we would respond by saying that even if this is all he intended, it still shows you the sophist epistemic commitment that he feels, attempting to show how or why we can tell of contingent things that they are indeed caused. How or why we can tell of them that they are caused? Being located is not a property of things that were caused to exist. It's a necessary property of all things that exist in reality. Okay, that's what we need to what they need to understand. That's how we respond to them in this manner or logic of theorization. Being located is not a property of things that were caused to exist. It's a necessary property of all things that exist in reality. Okay, but obviously, he's making it exclusive of things that he calls contingent. Why? Because he knows he is required by virtue of the Greek tradition of metaphysical theory to prove that things of this world are indeed all contingent rather than necessary. All are caused rather than uncaused. In that commitment, brothers and sisters, okay, he is no better than those who committed themselves to demonstrating that all things of the world have indeed begun to exist. حدثت بعد أن لم تكن. And that starting to exist or to be is indeed an exclusive property of the cosmos and its components. الحدوث. This is the reason why Ibn Taymiyyah rahimahullah treated both groups, followers of Ibn Sina and Ahlul Kalam, equally when it comes to method and epistemic commitment. Both groups were deeply committed to the Greek tradition of the metaphysical theory, of metaphysical theorization, and to an epistemology that necessitates that one can indeed show by means of some metaphysical analogy that all things of the world are such that they necessitate the existence of that being they believe is the one who created everything. And this is why he stated that they took roots that are not in the least fruitful, and that sane and reasonable human beings needed not do that. We are all born with innate knowledge that we have indeed been created by a Lord who deserves all reverence and all worship. We already know that. So if you wish to argue against someone who denies that fact, you can easily shame them by showing the ridiculous entailments of believing that he himself, any one of them, he himself came into being out of no cause at all, or that the ultimate cause of his existence was yet another creature like himself. You obviously need not refer to more than your own self and the fact that you did come into being after having not existed at all, and you know that for a fact. In doing so, you obviously do not need to establish by any means of theory that all things of the world have indeed begun to exist. You don't need to do that. The same is true with the question of contingency and necessary causation. As we elaborated earlier, nobody needs to be shown that all things of the world are indeed contingent or that they have all begun to exist. It's a profoundly sophist Greek epistemology that necessitates such a construction of knowledge under a man's faith in the unseen in order for them to be justified in believing that they were indeed created at all. Which is precisely why Ibn Taymiyyah countered by establishing fitra as actual knowledge in the human condition, because that's the way things are, that's the way humans are born. The ground of all knowledge is already inside us. We have the ground of that knowledge. We do know that we have been created by an omnipotent creator. And where he defined where he defined it as an innate propensity to know the truth about self-evident facts, fitra I mean, he meant that at birth, every child is born with the ability to know what is right and what is good, even before they learn language and linguistic associations, because as soon as they start expressing themselves in linguistic terms, they find that they have the knowledge that this is the truth and this is the fallacy. Okay, which is why in the Quran, Allah did not establish knowledge of the validity of Islam upon a propositional argument for His own existence. No. Rather, He founded it upon the pre-existing knowledge of the self-evident basic beliefs we outlined earlier, which include, of course, not only His existence, but the obvious fact that He is the greatest of all beings and the only one worthy of absolute worship. The only one worthy of absolute worship and submission. The Greeks, however, founded their academy on the grounds of an academic sophistry that leaves a man unjustified in holding any religion of any kind of or any kind of belief unless they have acquired it through rational argumentation. And by argumentation, they meant propositional arguments, of course, that when presented to someone else in a debate would convince them that the proposition, or potentially at least convince them that the proposition is at best true and at worst potentially justifiable, right? Thus, every claim of knowledge, no matter the subject or the pretext, became theoretical and propositional the moment some philosopher decided that after thinking deep enough they found that it had no proper rational grounds or premises upon which to build it. Theoretical premises. Okay? Thus was born the metaphysical approach of thinking about existing things. if, as is fairly obvious, we can only aspire to observe but a small part of the world around us, no matter how long we live or how far-reaching our senses would become, then we need to think hard enough for our minds to reveal to us the truth about all things we cannot see. If we wish to determine whether or not religion, any religion, for that matter, is justifiable or has sufficiently sound epistemic grounds, then it's from our minds that we should all start. It thus became a quasi-religious belief amongst the founding fathers of the Greek Academy that we have to start by thinking hard enough about all things in existence if we wish to determine our position in this world properly and what everything is all about. Or as the philosophers of old famously put it, why is there something rather than nothing? If we don't know why anything at all exists and how it exists as it does or not otherwise, okay, and why, then how can we even aspire to know if we have indeed been created at all, and if that creator does in fact deserve the attributes that followers of this religion or that are ascribing to him? Okay? So what we need to emphasize at this point as clearly as we can in this context, brothers and sisters, is that Ibn Taymiyyah, rahimahullah, as a giant imam of the tradition of Ahlul Athar, never, not for once, succumbed, submitted, or surrendered his mind or his knowledge to the Greek tradition, as thus described. He never thought that he needed, or anybody for that matter, to establish a holistic theory about that, or about all things that exist, as a philosopher or a mutakallim would do in order for his belief in the creator he worships to stand justified. I vividly recall Engineer Abdullah al-Ujayri, hadahullah, stating in an interview or a podcast or whatever, I'm not sure what it was, that Ibn Taymiyyah differed from mutakallimin in that he mentioned, or that in that he modified the Huduth argument, Burhan al-Huduth, to only be an argument from anything at all, that any single thing that we know for a fact to have begun to exist, rather than using the cosmos at large as a premise. They don't try to prove that the entire cosmos began to exist. By doing so, claims al-Ujayri, he was able to circumvent the pitfalls that come from having to submit to the theory of A'rad, Nazariyat al-A'rad, and the false entailments that it brought upon the beliefs of Mu'tazila, Ash'ara, and other sects of Mutakallimin. Then, in response to the objection that the argument does not suffice in proving that there was actually only one creator for all things that began to exist, rather than many, al-Ujayri claims Ibn Taymiyyah to have resorted to Burhan al-Tamanu'. Okay, now you have no choice but to wonder then, when or where did al-Ujayri ever happen upon a kalami debate with an atheist where Ibn Taymiyyah rahimahullah can be shown to have actually done that? Where? Okay, now to grant an atheist philosopher the wish to have the existence of a maker established for him on the grounds of some propositional argument that appeals to his tastes in metaphysical argumentation one way or another, or his first principles as a mutakallim or a philosopher would do. Okay, where did they ever see him do that, to grant an atheist philosopher the wish for that? Okay, if indeed Ibn Taymiyyah was thus inclined, and if he indeed ascribed to that sophist epistemology of the Greeks, would he have found it sufficient to use just one thing that we know for a fact to have started to exist as a premise in an argument for the existence of the creator he worships? Obviously not. Of course not. He would have found that he needed to defend against the claim that some existing things in the world can in fact be eternal and uncaused when we don't see them, while we're incapable of observing them. If the philosopher would grant you the claim that all things that under your observation have come to exist, but what about things that you have not observed yet? Okay? He would have thus felt that the Kalami approach with a cosmological argument would be best, or with a contingency argument which ultimately leads to the same universal categorization of existing things as the cosmological argument, in order to come out of that objection. But anyone who has ever bothered to read the legacy of the Imam, rahimahullah, in light of his athari creeds, not the creeds of philosophers and mutakallimin, would easily see that his entire project was to defeat that sophist tradition from the bottom up. Okay? Granted, some of his texts, when taken out of context, might make it sound like he did encourage the notion of metaphysical argumentation for the existence of God, but that's not how a true scholar, not to mention a Salafi one, would read those texts. Okay, self-proclaimed followers of the Salaf and of Ibn Taymiyyah, who insist on situating him somewhere within the discipline of Kalam and Kalami tradition, need to understand the way of the Salaf, that the way of the Salaf, Tariqat al-Salaf, of which he was the Imam of his time, is not just إثبات الصفات the way that he did. No, it's a creed that starts from the reasons the reasons we have for knowing that we've had a creator at all, and that the creator deserves, that creator deserves to be worshipped alone with no partners, and thereby the reason we have for accepting what the prophet teaches about him and his attributes. Those reasons are not the product of some metaphysical theory about existence that Ibn Taymiyyah or any other Imam of the Salafi tradition has embraced and founded upon in arguments with philosophers, as is the case with that creed, with the creeds of all Islamic philosophers and Kalami sects, all traditions of Kalam and of Islamic philosophy. No, that's not what Ibn Taymiyyah did. This is precisely what he spent his entire life fighting against, rahimahullah. The tradition itself and the method it uses, not just this or that argument. That's what he was fighting, the tradition itself, the Greek tradition. He spent much more of his time elaborating on the particular false beliefs that the method entailed in different Kalami sects, of course, than arguing against the method of metaphysical theory itself, the way that we're trying to do. For sociological reasons, I have no room to discuss here, but he did criticize the Greek tradition of metaphysical definition, al-hudud al-mantiqiyya, in the context of condemning the tradition of the logicians. In an entire treatise specified for that. The Greek principle of knowledge itself and the very definition of reason and rationality is at odds with the Salafi creed, not just the cosmological argument in particular, and that's what Ibn Taymiyyah endeavored to show. The notion of how we know that we were indeed created, if at all, how we learned about whoever it was that created us, and how we know that we need to learn why we were created at all these fundamental existential questions were built in that tradition upon sheer sophistry rather than real knowledge. That's what the Greeks did. Okay, now look at how thrilled Hijab is with what Ibn Sina did, despite repeating on every occasion that he agrees with Ibn Taymiyyah on his position with respect to philosophy and Kalam. What is philosophy, what is Kalam then, if this is what you believe, guys? If this is what he believes? Okay, this is the main issue here, brothers and sisters. It's not that he is drenched up to his neck in the Greek tradition of metaphysical thought, or that he is fond of Ibn Sina's literature, or that he teaches tafweed al-ma'na as the orthodox creed on the divine attributes, al-Mawqif al-Salafi sahih. He wouldn't be the first or the last preacher who wishes to acquire a seat somewhere amongst the most prominent debaters and apologists of the Western tradition in our time. Okay, but to do all that under the guise of following Ibn Taymiyyah of all people, and to all people who have finally learned to appreciate the Salafi creed, the creed of Ahlul Sunnah, into getting out of it under the tag of the Salafi creed itself and following Ibn Taymiyyah, that's a new trend that we need to do all we can to kill it before it spawns yet another sect of Jahmiyyah in the name of Ibn Taymiyyah, rahimahullah. Okay. I wouldn't have bothered responding to him at all, brothers and sisters, had he not presented himself to his followers as a student of the Salafi tradition and of Ibn Taymiyyah. Yani, so what? Someone is publishing an argument, has chosen to revive an argument of Ibn Sina himself. Yani, the man who has been condemned as a blasphemous, al-kaffaru al-asha'ira wal-mu'tazila, and pretty much all sects of Islam, of Islamic tradition, have judged him as a kafir. Okay, because of that argument and what he founded upon it. So what? Some preacher has decided to revive that argument. So what? Let him be. I don't care what he's doing. Okay. The problem is, however, is that not only is he gaining more followers every day, especially even in the Arab-speaking world as it stands, he's doing that in the name of Ibn Taymiyyah. He's doing that in the name of the Salafi tradition. Wallahu musta'an. He goes on to say, in the pointers and reminders, al-isharat wa tanbihat, Ibn Sina talks about a jumla, roughly translated as a sequence or even a set consisting of an infinite number of contingent things, arguing ad absurdum that such a set cannot be the necessary existence. Applying this to arguments posited by new atheists, this part of the argument is one of the most potent and useful proofs in arguing against infinite multiverse theses. Against an infinite multiverse thesis. Okay, we're going to see how potent it actually is. But okay, he goes on to say, this thesis is often employed as a substitute for a necessary existence or God, a point that will be expanded on in following chapters. In the metaphysics, Ibn Sina is most explicit in making a formular argument in Maqala, section 8, chapters 1 and 3. chapters 1 to 3 يعني. It merits consideration that Ibn Sina effectively ends his book with this argument, and in many ways, earlier chapters seem to build up to this point. In this section, Ibn Sina argues ad absurdum for the impossibility of an infinite regress, doing so in two novel ways highlighted below. First, arguing for the impossibility of middle causes having the same modal status, and second, employing an argument from composition. As will be explained, these types of arguments are perhaps best placed to deal with atheistic interrogations which stipulate an infinite multiverse. Alright, now in this part, Hijab exhibits his inability to properly comprehend what Ibn Sina was actually saying. Or perhaps he did comprehend it, but he tried to trick his followers into thinking that Ibn Sina's thesis actually works in debates with the atheists on their claims of an infinite multiverse. Now this error, or trickery, whichever way you choose to see it, is a consequence of the ambiguity inherent in what he describes as an infinite number of contingent things. The same ambiguity that rendered Ibn Sina's position fundamentally contradictory as he declared his belief in the entire eternity of the world. It is one thing to think of an infinity that is a series of caused things, and another thing entirely to think of an infinity that is a set of caused things. A set of caused things. Okay. By infinite contingent things, Ibn Sina pictured a string of dependent subsequent causes. Okay. A caused B, and B caused C, and C caused D in turn, and so on. He argued reasonably enough that such a series cannot be infinite from its past end. In other words, it has to start by a cause that is not in itself preceded by an earlier cause, or the obvious absurdity of such a regress would ensue. Okay? Now, obviously, a regress of causes has nothing to do with what atheists would claim when they stipulate an infinite multiverse. An infinite multiverse, in the sense that atheists suggest in response to the so-called anthropic principle, brothers and sisters, is not the assumption that universes have existed from eternity as a series where everyone is the cause of the originator of the one that follows. It's rather the assumption that an infinite number of independent universes do exist in parallel at this moment in an infinite quantum inflationary field that is still inflating, each with its own Big Bang and its own evolutionary story expanding with its own space-time. Okay, so the key word here is being independent, obviously. Okay, they are assumed not to be causally connected in any shape, way, or form. All right. So their being infinite in number has nothing to do with Ibn Sina's series of causes or set of contingent things. To refute that cosmology, we simply need to show the absurdity and inherent contradiction in the very notion of a physical space-time mind projection fallacy. That is, that space and time are actual things that exist in reality in a fabric or whatever, and of the contradiction of a contingent thing, the quantum field, being infinite in size, thereby leaving no place for its maker but to be within it or overlapping with it. And of course, the absurdity of something being infinite in size and yet is inflating at the same time. Okay, what is infinite in size? If something that has already reached the greatest size that can possibly be imagined, it makes no sense that that thing would still be presumed to continue to inflate or to get bigger or to get larger. All right. So it's not the regressive causes that refute such a ridiculous theory, guys. It's a host of other contradictions and absurdities that we can easily show and demonstrate. All right, and of course, it has to be made out clearly and laid out clearly here that when we do so, when we refute the multiverse thesis or the multiverse theory or whatever, we're not doing so in the sense that we have to show that we have been created and that we have had a creator by a certain premises, by a number of certain premises that would then thereby defeat the existence of a multiverse. No, that's not the case. We don't need to do that. All we need to do is to show and to state quite clearly that the belief in our Maker is self-evident. It's a necessary fact. A necessary fact of reason, whereas the claim that a multiverse exists and that it is all that exists in reality is simply a conjecture, okay, at best, okay. Of course, we do not even merit the grounds upon which that conjecture was founded, but okay, let's assume that it is simply a conjecture. But it's obviously clear that you cannot defeat a rational necessity on the grounds of a conjecture. All right. So that's it. That's all you need to do to dismiss this multiverse thesis. But look at what he's trying to do in order, so he claims, to dismiss it. Okay, to look into the books and get out an argument by one of the most detestable figures in the history of Islamic scholarship, to use such the central argument upon which he founded his entire belief system as a way to defeat the multiverse thesis. What is that? I mean, who does that? Okay, not even Mu'tazili would venture to do that. All right. So, in fact, to reasonably refute the claim that an infinite space, quantum or otherwise, exists with universes scattered in it, we have to challenge Ibn Sina's metaphysics to not rely on it, actually. Okay, come to think of it, yani. This is because Ibn Sina's metaphysics turned the very notion of location and place, as we pointed out earlier, into a physical property of contingent things. So if the necessary being he seeks to prove does not exist anywhere relative to other things, or cannot be located at all in principle, then it would follow by necessity that only contingent things exist in an infinite space in reality. In which case, not only would he fail to refute the multiverse thesis, he would even be compelled to embrace it himself, or any other cosmology that equally posits an infinite world. Okay, a boundless world in the expanse of space. And thanks to your Jahmi belief that Allah is not in the world or outside of it, and cannot be described as being literally above the world or anywhere else at all, okay, you too have to no defense against the multiverse thesis, Hijab. You too are compelled to accept it. After all, if Allah cannot be located anywhere, then wherever one goes in any direction, then there should still be more and more of the world around him. Okay, no matter how far, because there can be no space with absolute nothingness filling it. Okay, so if only things of the world have locations and places in existence with respect to each other, then it follows that only the world exists in reality. And that's exactly what an atheist wishes to prove. Okay, that's exactly what an atheist believes. Okay, and thus the maker you're taking all those pains in attempt to prove is not in fact the God that we Muslims worship. It's rather the abstract, unreal maker of the philosophers, the being that exists in no time, no place, and with no attributes whatever. The one that Ibn Taymiyyah described as an impossible entity that can only exist in the mind. Okay, so did Ibn Sina really show that a set of contingent things cannot be infinite, as Hijab here is trying to have us believe? Absolutely not. Rejecting an infinite regressive causes is one thing, and rejecting an infinite set of all contingent things is another. And while he did the first, he did not do the latter, brothers and sisters. He didn't even attempt to do it. How would he, when in fact he believed in an eternal world? Why did he believe in an eternal world? Because it was trendy amongst the philosophers? No, because his metaphysics of contingency and necessity implied it, as I elaborated in the previous lecture. He did embrace a set of infinite contingent things, all being generated by the eternal maker from eternity past, okay, continuously. He acknowledged them being ordered in layers of causes, or chains, if you will, and he argued that every chain should inexorably lead to the uncaused cause at the start of it, but they would be infinite in count nonetheless. They would be infinite in count, and the set itself, of which they're all parts, is infinite in its expanse, okay, because he did not believe that the world had a beginning. Okay, the set of all things contingent does not have a beginning in his theology, does not have a beginning in his metaphysics, in Ibn Sina's metaphysics. Okay, which is why Ibn Taymiyyah criticized him in his books as having claimed that something can be contingent and yet have no beginning in the past. Okay, being qadim and mumkin at the same time, simultaneously. All right, so it is really surprising how deeply he misunderstood Ibn Sina's argument in this concern. It's really surprising. He says that, meaning the necessity of an initial uncaused cause for any set of caused things, yani, is the case regardless of whether the things at the middle is one thing or more than one thing. If it is more than one thing, then it is either finite or infinite. If it is finite, and then the set is between two extremities, i.e. the first cause and the final effect. Therefore, each of the things in between these two extremities will have a specialized status. okay, a modal status, which corresponds to the finitude of the set. And I say, no, it would not correspond to the finitude of the set. Ibn Sina is arguing regardless of the number of things that came in the middle between the first cause or causes and the final effect or effects, as we can clearly see. Okay, so how can this be an argument for the finitude of the set? It's inconsequential. Okay, he goes on to say, Ibn Sina expands this argument of an infinite set in both the pointers and the deliverance by considering a circular finite set. Herbert Davidson addresses this point in his work on medieval Kalam, scholastic theology, entitled as Proofs for Eternity. He says a contained circular regress is shown to be absurd by an argument applying only to it. Okay, in the circular regress XYZ, X would be a distant cause of Z, and Z would be the immediate cause of X. X would consequently be a distant cause of itself, which Avicenna regards as absurd. By the same token, X would be a distant effect of itself, which is equally absurd. And the point can be made again in a slightly different way as follows. X would be dependent for its existence upon something Z, whose existence is posterior to it. But when the existence of something depends upon the existence of something else that is essentially posterior to the first, the existence of the first is impossible. Okay, a self-contained circular regress of causes cannot therefore exist. Okay, so where is the argument for the finitude of the entire set? He is merely trying to show that chains of causes can only be linear, not circular, which is obvious. Okay, are you under the illusion, Brother Hijab, that if the set of contingent things was infinite, then that would imply circular causation? Unless you think so, I cannot see what good this long quotation does for your case in any modern debate concerning the so-called infinite multiverse. It doesn't have anything to do with it. He proceeds, having dealt with a finite cause, Ibn Sina moves on to address the infinite regress objection, stating, if the set, on the other hand, is infinite, then such extremities, the first cause and final effect, will not have been realized, and all things in the set will have the equivalent status of the things between two sets, i.e., they will not be first cause or final effects, there will be middle causes. Okay, obviously that's true. So what? He goes, on this rendering and returning back to our P1 to P10 example, P1, P5, and P10 are meaningless in an infinite set. All points have the same modal specification, and they cannot possibly be considered in initiators or middle points or final effects. No. Okay, they would be meaningless in an infinite series with no starting point, not in an infinite set. Okay, again, with the ambiguity and interchanging use of the word set and sequence or series. A set does not have two extremities, Hijab. A series does. Okay, but again, it's Ibn Sina's fault, not Hijab's, because he insisted on addressing a set of all contingent things that have ever existed, when in fact he is only in reality addressing a single chain of dependent contingent things. That chain might have more than one member, of course, at each level of causation or modality in it, as in saying, for example, subset A, the group of things that are called subset A, caused subset B to exist, which is another group of things, contingent things, and B in turn caused subset C after it, and so forth. But we're still talking about a linear series nonetheless. The set of all things that have ever been caused to exist is obviously not a single linear series, not even close. But a philosopher is bound to fall victim to scandalous reductionism the moment he decides to theorize about all things that exist and have ever existed, as the Greek tradition teaches him. All types and classes of existing things that exist beyond his limited pathetic imagination would be reduced in nature and constitution by necessity, with the strike of a pen, to a mandatory similarity with just one kind, the nature of which he is familiar with in his immediate experience. Okay, all things of the world must be such and such, made up of so and so, or such that they cause this or that to each other upon contact, etc. The ethos being here, the common value is it is only allowed to exist if and only if I, the philosopher, can place it one way or another in my theory of all things. All right, so you can see how arrogant this position is. Look at Hijab, as he admits that he finds it startling that Ibn Sina ended up being an eternalist despite arguing against the regressive causes. He says, Ibn Sina, like Aristotle, was an eternalist. In other words, he actually believed that the universe was pre-eternal. Okay? I don't know what he meant by pre-eternal. What we say is eternal. Okay, but whatever. This startling fact puts him at odds, he goes on, with many Islamic thinkers who opposed such notions, most notably Al-Ghazali. Despite believing in an eternal universe, Ibn Sina, like Aristotle, argued quite clearly for the impossibility of an infinite regress of causes. All right. If he gave himself enough time to properly understand the entire set of implications and entailments of Ibn Sina's Burhan, such implications that eventually forced him to infuse his argument to some extent with the metaphysics of the Mutakallimin and to embrace eternalism at the same time, then maybe, just maybe, Hijab wouldn't have found this fact so startling. It looks, however, that he's betting on the ignorance of his followers. Wallahu musta'an. He goes on to say, in addition to the argument from middle causes, Ibn Sina makes an argument from composition in the following manner. So we say that the necessary existence cannot be considered a composite construction such that there is a certain whatness attributed or attributable whatness attribute كيفية يعني, and that such whatness is itself the quality of necessity. It would be logically impossible that in such a whatness there is an actual reality. For if it had a reality, and that it was differentiated from the necessary existence, then it would indicate that something unnecessary had brought about something necessary, and this would indicate that the thing in question is not in fact necessary. He comments, the argument from composition suggests, okay, look at the words that he's using now, suggests, is all that you're doing here is just a mere suggestion? No, but that's because this is the language that philosophers have been using recently in their literature, and so he has to use it too. He says, the argument from composition suggests that anything which is composed is generated and is therefore dependent. If there is a quality within something that makes it necessary and capable of being extracted from while also being characterized with differentiation, then it would suggest that the entity in question is in need of it. As such, this would be enough proof to indicate the contingency of that entity. A proof or a suggestion. حيرتنا معاك. Okay, he says, taking Ibn Sina's premise that any composed entity that exists by its parts and not by virtue of itself is composite, and therefore any composite is dependent, the prospect of an infinite number of contingent things in existence becomes an impossible prospect to maintain. Alright, now this, brothers and sisters, is precisely how Ibn Sina founded his denial of Allah's attributes, on his metaphysical definition of necessary existence. Okay, the same definition that Hijab here seems to have no problem with, and even finds it quite useful to employ in debates with neo-atheists in response to their multiverse myth. The necessary existence, according to Ibn Sina, is not and cannot be a real entity in the outside world, outside of the mind, because if it were, then it would necessarily acquire certain intrinsic realities in itself that differentiate it from other existing things in reality. Relative location being somewhere relative to something else, temporal simultaneity, existing at the same time as something else, extension in all directions, having a distinct identifiable edge had that separates it from anything else, and being a whole that has identifiable parts, or what he generally calls composition here. Right? Anything that exists in reality should differ from any other thing that exists in reality outside of the mind in these respects. Otherwise, it would not be distinct, separate from something else, or it would not exist at all in reality, apart from that abstract image that might be in someone's mind. Yani. This is not some metaphysical theory of existence that I'm propagating or proposing as opposed to Ibn Sina's claims, brothers and sisters. This is all a necessary entailment of claiming that something does in fact exist in reality outside of one's mind. This is why Ibn Taymiyyah rahimahullah explained in his books that Ibn Sina's definition or notion of necessary existence renders the maker that he argues for as nothing more than an abstract meaning that cannot exist in reality. Okay, موجود مطلق على شرط الإطلاق. He did not counter Ibn Sina's definition with another metaphysical theory that he had come up with on his own in defining what makes things real or what makes things exist in the outside world or outside of the mind. He refuted him with rational necessities that follow from the very notion of something existing at all in reality. If it's neither here nor there, neither inside of X or outside of it or overlapping it, then it's nowhere at all to be found. And being nowhere at all is the very meaning of non-existence, guys. The same is true of being tenseless or atemporal, as the modern terminology would have it. If it exists such that we cannot say that it exists at the same time that X exists in reality, or before it existed, or after it existed, then it doesn't exist at all. Okay, if it exists such that it has no extension in some direction, its sides or edges are identical and cannot be told apart, then it only exists as an abstract thing in our minds. Okay, and if it has extensions in all directions, then by necessity it is a whole that has parts that can be identified from one another in principle. Okay, these aspects, brothers and sisters, are not exclusively the properties of a creature. They are necessary meanings for anything at all to have a distinct existence in reality outside of the mind. The Greek tradition is what reduced them into properties of things of this world. The Greek tradition did that. Why? Because the metaphysical theory of existing things is built such that it tells us what makes everything real, anything at all. Everything that can be described as existing outside of the mind must be such that the theory can tell us why it is the way that it is and not any other way, why it exists. Okay, that's what the theory is about. Okay, that's what the Greeks did theory for. It's why they bother at all with proposing it. A theory of existence qua existence. Okay, a theory of existence qua existence. Existence as per se, existence as existence in the very principle of it. Not of particularly observable things of the world or things that fall under our accumulated human experience. No. It has to be a theory of all things. Now, due to that arrogant sophist epistemology of the Greek fathers of the scholastic tradition, whatever claim a philosopher proposed about what makes real things observable or even differentiable from other things that can be told apart, one thing from another, as sophist as the query itself may be, had to be a theory about everything that can in fact exist in reality. Any categorization of existing things that a Greek philosopher proposed had to be such that it encompasses all things that exist in reality, actually and potentially, leaving nothing out of the classification it proposes. Nothing at all. So when one such Greek theory claims that things as such differ in their attributes and characteristics in reality because they are composed of so-called bodies, essences, or substances, al-ajsam wal-jawahir, and of something else that is called accidents, al-a'rad, where both these components are in principle real, separable parts, it does not hold that claim to apply only to created things. No, it holds it to be true of all things that can be described as existing in reality and being differentiable from other things. Alright? Anything that differs from anything else in any meaning at all, then that difference is to be explained by the accident, al-arad. Okay, by the accident that is necessarily a separable component in both things. Okay, both things that you're trying to differentiate from each other. So that's what a theory of existence is about in the Greek tradition. So when the mutakallim takes such a spectacular claim about all things and seeks to establish a proof upon it for the existence of his creator, upon its definitions, he is committing an intellectual crime against the creator, because obviously we believe, and we have to believe as Muslims, that he is not such that a part of him is separable, the part because of which he differs from other things in all of his attributes. No, the very notion itself of the accident, al-arad, is a fallacious analogy that turns abstract meanings into a real entity that explains all attributes by composition, بالتركب. So when they swallowed the metaphysics of that theory, as fallacious as it is, it was no surprise that they had to succumb to its entailments, which essentially mean that whatever being they seek to prove as the maker of all things, who does not himself consist of separable parts, that being cannot be a jism, okay, according to the theory, or have accidents, a'rad, as components of his self, and thus he cannot have any attributes at all, okay, because that's how attributes come to be. This is precisely why Mu'tazila and extreme Jahmiyyah knew they had no choice but to deny all attributes as a'rad and accuse all those who disagree with them of anthropomorphism أو تجسيم. خلاص؟ لأن كل الصفات ناشئة عن أعراض عندهم. If it has an attribute that can be differentiated in any way from attributes of worldly things, then it is by necessity of the theory a jism, and that is tajsim. So the way out of this deep fallacy is to show the falsity of the theory itself, not to seek a way to amend it with such attributes that one would be deemed blasphemous, kafir, if he were to deny them like the Ash'ara and Maturidiyya attempted to do. Okay? That's how those two sects were founded, Aslan. The same methodological sophistry is true of the theory of Ibn Sina here, although he did not start from a Greek theory like the Mutakallimin did. Rather, the Mutakallimin took that theory of Gawhar and Arad and modified it for their purposes. That's not what Ibn Sina did. Rather, he sought to establish his own theory of existence, at least at first, yani. He thought to establish his own theory of existence, following the Greek example in that, of course. The theory, true to the Greek tradition, seeks to provide distinctive characteristics of both the contingent existence and the necessary existence, okay, such that it can be said of all things of this world that they are indeed either contingent or necessary. خلاص. Things can only exist if and only if they fall under one of these two categories. So how does he proceed to do that? By attaching the meaning of contingency to all aspects that make all things identifiable or differentiable from each other, thereby leaving the meaning of necessary existence as nothing but an abstraction that cannot be attributed to anything at all in reality. Okay? If X is real and Y is also real, and they exist outside of the mind, and they differ in any aspect or property, whatever, in reality, as can be seen in all observable things around us, of course, then they are both contingent by necessity. Okay, the theory has to go as such. They are contingent because why? Because they differ from each other in real aspects that can be said to exist in themselves or unto themselves. ملازمة لها أو قائمة بها في الأعيان يعني. If those aspects or attributes or characteristics can, rationally speaking, be any way other than the way that they actually are, then the very fact that something has those attributes makes it necessarily a contingent thing that had to be caused to be the way that it is by another thing. It thus cannot be the uncaused cause. It cannot be the uncaused cause. But obviously this is by no means a rational necessity. Of course we can reason a being that differs from all things in many meanings and attributes that it shares with other things in its basic principle, like place, speech, power, creativity, knowledge, will, deeds, etc. And yet it is not the way that it is because some other being had caused it to be that way, but because it has always been that way by necessity. We can conceive of a being such. We reason it because we know by fitra or innate knowledge that our maker is precisely that being. Okay? But because Ibn Sina had committed himself to the Greek tradition of metaphysical theory, he felt he had to provide some theoretical explanation, some holistic analogy, قياس شمول, for the very fact that existing things differ from each other in anything at all. Otherwise, how can he convince a sophist opponent that the necessary being he seeks to prove is not a thing of this world or even the world itself? So he establishes a Greek metaphysical definition of both contingency and necessity that effectively reduces the necessary existence into an abstract entity that cannot exist outside of the mind in any conceivable way. If it exists in reality and can be said to differ from other things, existing things in reality too, in anything at all, then it is a contingent thing. So what is the necessary existence? Nothing but an abstract thought by necessity. You've left nothing out of the definition of contingency. Okay, we Muslims know by necessity, both rational and religious, that our Maker is not his creatures. All right, he exists in reality as a distinct thing separate from his creation, not as an abstract meaning in our minds. So it surprises me to no end that this man, Muhammad Hijab, would still insist on associating himself with Ibn Taymiyyah and the thought of Ibn Taymiyyah in any way, shape or form, despite accepting such a catastrophic argument. Let's take a quick look, brothers and sisters, at just a few quotations from Ibn Taymiyyah that I know for a fact that Hijab couldn't have missed reading his books. Okay? One such quotation is, he said, وَبَنَى ابن سينا الكلام في نفي صفاته على كونه واجب الوجود في الجواب الصحيح. And Ibn Sina founded his rejection of Allah's attributes on his being a necessary existence. يقول فإن أهل الكلام المحدث لما احتجوا بحدوث الأفعال على حدوث الفعل الذي قامت به الأفعال وزعموا أن إبراهيم الخليل احتج بهذا وأن المراد بالأفول الحركة والانتقال في قوله تعالى يعني لا أحب الآفلين وأنه استدل بذلك على حدوث المتحرك والمنتقل نقل ابن سينا هذه المادة إلى أصله وذكر هذا في إشاراته فجعل هذا الأفول عبارة عن الإمكان وقال إنما هوى في حظيرة الإمكان هوى في حظيرة الأفول ولفظه يعني الكلام اللي قاله فإن الهوية أو الهوية في حظيرة الإمكان أفول ما وذلك أنه أراد أن يقول بقول سلفي الفلاسفة مع قوله بما يشبه طريقة المتكلمين والمتكلمون استدلوا على حدوث الجسم بطريقة التركيب فجعل هو التركيب دليلا على الإمكان. خلاص. when those who engaged with innovated kalam use the advent of deeds as argument for the advent of the doer who did the deeds, and claim that Ibrahim alayhi salam argued as such, and that the word al-uful in the Quran means motion and translocation, and that Ibrahim used that as argument for the advent of the moving and the translocating, Ibn Sina took this material and changed it to fit his metaphysical theory, mentioning this in his pointers. He made al-uful a statement of contingency and said, what falls in the category of contingency falls in the category of setting, al-uful. In his own words, falling in the category of contingency is setting of some sort. This is because he wished to follow his ancestors, the philosophers, while stating what resembles the method of mutakallimin, who took the concept of composition as argument for the advent of bodies, huduth al-ajsam. He took the same concept as argument for the contingency of things. Okay. All right. ابن تيمية also says ويقول ابن تيمية أيضا فإن تسمية الرب واجبا بذاته وجعل ما سواه ممكنا ليس هو قول أرسطو وقدماء الفلاسفة، ولكن كانوا يسمونه مبدأ وعلة ويثبتونه من جهة الحركة الفلكية، فيقولون إن الفلك يتحرك للتشبه به، فركب ابن سينا وأمثاله مذهبا من قول أولئك وقول المعتزلة. فلما قالت المعتزلة الموجود ينقسم إلى قديم وحادث وإن القديم لا صفة له، قال هؤلاء إنه ينقسم إلى واجب وممكن والواجب لا صفة له. ولما قال أولئك يمتنع تعدد القديم قال هؤلاء يمتنع تعدد الواجب. منهاج السنة. Calling the Lord necessary by himself and everything else contingent is not what Aristotle and the philosophers of old said. Rather, they used to call him the origin or the cause, the ultimate cause, and argue for him from the motion of celestial bodies, saying celestial bodies move to be like him. So Ibn Sina and his followers concocted the theory from that theory and from the theory of the Mu'tazila. So as the Mu'tazila said, existing things are either eternal or novel, and the eternal has no attributes. Ibn Sina and his followers also said existing things are either necessary or contingent, and the necessary has no attributes. And as the Mu'tazila said the eternal can't be a multitude, they, Ibn Sina and his followers, also said the necessary can't be a multitude. يقول وعمدة ابن سينا وأمثاله على نفيها هي حجة التركيب، وهو أنه لو كان له صفة لكان مركبا، والمركب مفتقر إلى جزئيه وجزآه غيره، والمفتقر إلى غيره لا يكون واجبا بنفسه. وقد تكلم الناس على إبطال هذه الحجة من وجوه كثيرة بسبب أن لفظ التركيب والجزء والافتقار والغير ألفاظ مجملة، فيراد بالمركب ما ركبه غيره وما كان مفتقرا فاجتمع، وما يقبل التفريق، والله سبحانه منزه عن هذا بالاتفاق. وأما الذات الموصوفة بصفات لازمة لها فإذا سمى المسمي هذا تركيبا كان هذا اصطلاحا له ليس هو المفهوم من لفظ المركب في منهاج السنة. Ibn Sina's argument and his followers in denying Allah's attributes is the argument from composition. That is, if it has any attributes at all, then it is composed, and anything that is composed is in need for its parts, and its parts are not itself, and whatever needs anything apart from itself cannot be necessary by itself. Many people have refuted that argument on many grounds due to the ambiguity of the word composition, part, need, and anything apart from itself. By composed, they mean what was brought together by the agency of another thing, or what was separated and got composed, and what is separable. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala cannot be ascribed to such meanings as agreed upon by all sects. But the entity that is described by attributes that are always in it or with it, if such were to be called composition, then that would be nothing more than his own jargon, the one who uses it, not what it to be understood in common linguistic use from the word composed. ومنهم من قال إن الباري هو الوجود المطلق بشرط الإطلاق كما يقول ابن سينا وأتباعه، فقوله أشد فسادا، فإن المطلق بشرط الإطلاق لا يكون إلا في الأذهان لا في الأعيان. And some of them, the philosophers, said that that maker is absolute existence, said that the maker is absolute existence, is an absolute existence on the condition of absolution, يعني. As Ibn Sina and his followers said, and that's more fallacious, since the absolute on the condition of absolution only exists in the minds, not in the real world. يقول وكذلك ما ابتدعوا في هذه الطريق ابن سينا وأتباعه من الاستدلال بالممكن على الواجب أبطل من ذلك، كما قد بسط ذلك في غير هذا الموضع. وحقيقته أن كل موجود فهو ممكن ليس في الوجود موجود بنفسه، مع أنهم جعلوا هذا طريقا لإثبات الواجب بنفسه، كما يجعل أولئك هذا طريقا لإثبات القديم، وكلاهما يناقض ثبوت القديم والواجب، فليس في واحد منهما إثبات قديم ولا واجب بنفسه، مع أن ثبوت موجود قديم وواجب بنفسه معلوم بالضرورة. And so is what Ibn Sina and his followers invented under this method, arguing for the necessary from the contingent. It's even more false, as I elaborated elsewhere, and it boils down to claiming that every existing thing is contingent. Nothing in existence is self-sufficient. Despite the fact that they made this theory of contingency, their route to proving a being that is necessary and self-sufficient, like those mutakallimin, make that a way to proving the eternal, and they both contradict the existence of the eternal and the necessary being. Neither does in fact prove the eternal or the necessary by itself, despite the fact that believing in the existence of an eternal being and a necessary being by itself, self-sufficient is known to be true by necessity. Okay, so obviously anyone who has ever read Ibn Taymiyyah, and that's just a part of a plethora of parts where Ibn Taymiyyah criticizes this argument, guys. Okay, so obviously anyone who has ever read Ibn Taymiyyah and has ever been a student of the true way of the Salaf should be able to realize the magnitude of the crime that Hijab is committing here, promoting that argument from composition as a means to refute the modern infinite multiverse theory. If you're not aware of the implications of that argument, brother Hijab, then go to someone who can teach them to you. And if you are, then declare yourself for what you really are, a philosopher who is not even bothered or concerned with the way of the Salaf. Quit committing that intellectual crime you still insist on by ascribing yourself to Ibn Taymiyyah. Okay? And if you think that you can use an argument in refuting someone's claims and not be committed to or concerned with the entailments of its premises in any way, then maybe you should just quit debating atheists, writing and preaching about these issues altogether, and find yourself another job. Because believe me, brother, you will not be able to tolerate the penalty of leading countless people astray when the day comes and you stand accountable, naked, accountable for your deeds on the day of judgment. He goes on to say, this point is particularly relevant to the discussion of the new atheism movement and its interrogations of theism. In his three-part specialized podcast by Ibn Sina, Peter Adamson mentions the relevance of this argument to modern-day discussions between theists and atheists when discussing the part of Ibn Sina's argument in which he examines the implausibility of the entire set of existence being necessary in its parts are contingent. He examines the implausibility of the entire set of existence being necessary if its parts are contingent. Adamson refers to Bertrand Russell's famous fallacy of composition objection. The later will be revisited in great detail in the chapter on objections. Adamson provides the example of a big clock made up of small parts and mentions that just because there are causes within the universe, it does not necessarily mean that the universe itself has a cause. Adamson explains that this sounds like the sort of thing a modern-day atheist may say. Avicenna is relaxed on this point. He sees that an opponent might raise this objection, and as if shrugging his shoulders, says that in that case the opponent would just be saying that in that case the opponent would just be giving him what he wants. After all, he is out to prove that there is a necessary existence. The opponent has actually admitted that. It's just that the opponent thinks that the necessary existence is the universe itself. The objection is no objection at all then, but a capitulation. Alright, okay, having said this, Hijab comments, Adamson explains that according to Ibn Sina, the universe or the set of universe cannot be the necessary existence because if a single necessary existence had parts, then something would need to distinguish those parts from one another. But then, by the same reasoning, we just use the parts would wind up being different from one another and then they would not be necessary. But how can a necessary existence be contingent in parts or have contingent parts? Alright, now notice, brothers and sisters, how he quotes Western commenters on the argument who explicitly state that he does not in any way, shape or form make a belief in a person creator necessary. Not only so, they actually know that Ibn Sina wasn't bothered by that at all, since all he wanted to do was establish some form of necessary existence, whatever it may be. And yet he doesn't feel, Hijab, in the least concerned with the magnitude of the damage that using that argument can cause. All he feels the need to do is claim that there should be no damage at all because the argument simply proves that a worldview without a necessary being, any necessary being, is fundamentally flawed. In an obvious act of pretentious causation, he goes on to say, when using Ibn Sina's arguments pastorally, it is important to note the threshold at which an interlocutor has shifted away from atheistic explanations and moved towards explanations which are somewhat more commensurate with theism and classical theism. The purpose of these logical arguments is not to convince the interlocutor of all of the attributes of God in accordance with the scripture by arguing, as Ibn Sina does above, from first principles. Rather, the prime objective is to demonstrate to an atheistic detractor that a worldview which does not acknowledge the status of an originator of existence is deficient and can be easily repudiated. Okay, and here, brothers and sisters, I say, is where the epitome of the Greek tradition of sophistry materializes itself in this man's method. Here is where he declares his sheer and utter departure from the way of the Salaf and the way of Ibn Taymiyyah, and in fact, of every sane, reasonable person in addressing atheism. By the way, here, I mean the method of da'wah, and more generally, the method of building arguments to establish claims of knowledge about reality and to refute opposing claims. As for da'wah, it is obviously no excuse to just say in some footnotes or a passing comment such as this that we should be careful not to use such arguments for convincing the interlocutor of all of the attributes of God just to demonstrate the falsity of the atheistic worldview. It is no excuse because rationally and epistemically speaking, there is no using an argument that is founded entirely upon premises that entail the denial of the attributes of the God you claim to be trying to argue for, an argument that at best would prove a theistic being, which is not even the case with this argument here, and yet ask for the debater to only focus on it being proof for the falsity of his atheistic worldview and be happy that it allegedly defeats that view and end it there. Essentially, this is how it all goes, brothers and sisters. This is how it has to go, rationally speaking. Okay, doctrine A is false because X is true. X entails Z, therefore doctrine A is false because Z is true. Alright, this, brothers and sisters, right here is where the way of the Salaf and the way of Kalam and Greek philosophy differ fundamentally. Okay, when it comes to addressing atheists with da'wah, that is, in the general sophist approach to debate and rational discourse, in the sophist approach to debate and rational approach embraced by the Greeks, it would be okay to forge an argument that defeats the opponent's position in a debate, even if its premises entail the falsity of my entire belief system. I can easily do that without feeling any problem or any pressure whatsoever, even if the entailments of that argument would defeat my own religion. Okay? If the goal is to defeat this particular opponent in this particular debate, and I have indeed achieved that, then it doesn't matter what follows from my argument. What other entailments follow from my argument. Okay? That's not what the debate is about. We can take care of that later if we ever need to. This is not the stance. This, brothers and sisters, is by no means the stance of someone who is sincere about calling his subjects to follow the right path and embrace the true religion. It's the stance and the way of someone who only wishes to come out victorious in a public debate no matter what. Let people believe whatever they choose to believe. Let them all go to hell for all he cares. All he wishes to achieve is defeat the opponent, and if that is achieved, then that's all he needs to do. Then he's fine. He did it. Okay. That's why when Ibn Sina was countered by the fact that his argument might as well result in making the set of contingent things itself the necessary being that the argument proves, he said it didn't matter because he would still have succeeded in proving the existence of some necessary existence all the same. Okay, which is what he set out to do anyway. Alright, you see the magnitude of the nifaq and dishonesty inherent in ascribing such a method to da'wah and debate to the ways of Islam, brothers and sisters. This is the way of the Kalam, the way of the Greek philosophers. Let the debate go wherever it wishes to go, wherever it should, for the opponent to admit defeat, and then let us see how we can rid ourselves of the entailments later, if we ever do. And of course, to do so, to get out of the entailments and show himself to have in fact established the existence of the God we Muslims worship, Ibn Sina founded other arguments, additional arguments on other metaphysical assumptions that deeply contradict his initial theory of necessary and contingency, or at least implied those contradicting foundations. And so did the Mutakallimun, by the way, when they set out to prove that the maker they established from their cosmological arguments, Burhan al-Huduth, did in fact have certain attributes at all. In proving those attributes, they flat out contradicted the theory of أعراض, نظرية الأعراض, committing exactly what they would otherwise have to condemn as tajseem. And the Mu'tazila condemned them precisely for that. Okay, this is exactly what Hijab would find himself compelled to do at some point, sooner or later, as long as he adheres to this argument. Because obviously, you cannot ask people to get out of atheism and instead embrace the belief in some maker, as abstract as that might be, without committing the belief in that maker you're calling for to the entailments and implications of the very argument you employed in proving his existence in the first place. You would be committing a profound contradiction in claiming that his attributes are those that your scripture teaches, when in fact the argument you employed is in proving his existence implies that he has no attributes at all. You would be contradicting yourself. Okay, this is why all philosophers and mutakallimun had to deal with those entailments seriously. Okay, and believe me, brother, the people you seek to engage with using this argument or anything like it are not blind to this fact. This very quotation by Adamson you just used here is a testament to just that. So who are you trying to fool, really? The Muslims you claim to be arguing for their Lord as they know and find in their scripture, or the atheists you claim to be providing with a defeater for their atheistic worldview? Because it really does neither, brother. It does neither. Okay? It's basically a Greek method of fooling all involved parties into believing that one of them has defeated the other, when in fact they are all just killing time and playing around. Okay, with rational entailments and the likes, having fun with the thrill of the debate and with the sophisticated arrangements it includes as they come. That's all they're doing. Then you come out of the argument feeling happy and proud and victorious that the atheist was crushed by your hands, if he actually was, which is seldom ever the case anyway. But yeah, and so you think that you have automatically proven the belief system you claim to belong to, in this case Islam, to be the truth, when in reality the belief system you yourself are required to embrace by entailments of from what you did in the debate is in fact not at all the religion you ascribe to, and is really no better than the atheistic worldview you think you have defeated in the debate. So who are you trying to fool, really, claiming that we shouldn't take the details of our belief in the Creator we worship and his attributes from the entailments of such an argument? Are we required to accept a fundamental contradiction at the very basis of our belief system? Whatever is founded on falsity is itself false, brother. That's self-evident. Or do you think otherwise? We Muslims believe that a preacher, a da'iyah, should seek to save his subjects from their false beliefs and all the falsities that those beliefs imply, and guide them to the true belief and all the truths that it entails. That's what we're out to do when we call to Islam. A philosopher, however, and a mutakallim subsequently, is not bothered by that. He only seeks, according to the Greek tradition of debate, to achieve victory in whatever particular topic he chooses to debate with his opponents. Anything else that follows from what he established in that debate, is irrelevant. At least to as far as the debate itself is concerned. It could be taken care of later, if at all, if they find that they have to. And they would, of course, because you wouldn't claim to be arguing for the existence of the God that we Muslims worship without getting heat from scholars of Islam who know that your argument entails not just a different God from the one that they worship, but the irrationality of his actual existence as a real thing outside of our minds from the word go. He concludes this chapter by saying, to summarize, Ibn Sina's Burhan argument can be categorized as a cause-based argument from contingency. The thrust of the argument is that existence cannot contain only contingent actualities, as contingent existence cannot bring rise to itself. A collection of contingent existence, whether finite or infinite, is not self-sufficient or necessary, as such a collection is made up of many component parts. If there is anything to differentiate part A from part B, such a thing would indicate the non-necessity of part A or part B, as well as the whole which is being described. For this reason, the necessary existent cannot be composed of component parts. Okay, yeah, and for this exact reason I say you cannot claim to be a follower of the Salaf in your belief with regards to the attributes and deeds of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. End of story. The maker you believe in, Hijab, cannot be the God we Muslims worship, because ascribing any of the meanings we ascribe to him would automatically make him a contingent being according to your metaphysics. This is what your argument entails, regardless of whether or not you wish to admit it, because you chose to embrace Ibn Sina's concepts of necessary existence and contingent existence. and how he defined them, you would be committing the exact same contradiction that Ibn Sina himself committed if you claimed that you can in fact ascribe any attributes at all to your God, and on grounds of that metaphysical classification of existing things, or at least without contradicting them. So be brave, man. Okay, what I'm trying to tell this man here, what I'm trying to tell Hijab is be brave. Okay, don't be a coward. Don't shy away from declaring that you do not agree with the entire doctrine of Sifat in the Salafi tradition. Don't come up pretending that you only have a problem with the way that we teach it. Be honest for once in your life and say it as it is, up front. Declare that you are in fact a philosopher who only believes in the abstract necessary meaning that the Burhan implies for necessity, not in the real being that we Muslims believe in outside of our minds. Admit the implications of your proof and embrace them openly, or get out of it altogether. There is no middle ground here. He goes on to say, in addition, because of this reason, a set of contingent existences, whether finite or infinite, cannot be a necessary existence. Not true. That's not true. The argument, as far as it goes, does not imply that the set itself cannot be necessary existence. Ibn Sina himself admitted that much. Okay, if not by implication, yani, if not by direct statement, but then by implication. What is true of every member of the set is not necessarily true of the set itself. You are committing a composition fallacy if you make such a claim. After all, if all he can demonstrate from such an argument is that some abstract existence is necessary, then why not make that abstract existence the set itself, the abstract collection of all that exists? Because it cannot cause anything to exist, as the number 2 or the letter S cannot. But such is the case with a being that cannot be claimed to differ from any existing thing in reality in any meaning whatsoever, because if it did, then that would make it contingent. So you really have nothing to set your God apart with from the actual nothingness that Ibn Sina's metaphysics implies. He concludes, in application, Richard, who I have described in the introduction, may reject the proposition of a necessary existence in exchange for an infinite multiverse. The question that may be posed to Richard is whether such a multiverse is self-sufficient or dependent. If Richard replies that it is dependent, then the question is it dependent on something which is dependent or something which is independent, self-sufficient? If independent, then there is agreement at least on the point that there exists an independent entity, alright? If dependent, then is there an infinite regress of dependent things? If so, what does such infinite regress depend on? Richard may say that it depends upon nothing. If this is so, Richard is admitting the infinite multiverse is independent. Again, a point of agreement, as Richard would be agreeing to the existence of something self-sufficient. Okay, you see what I mean, brothers and sisters? The target is just to prove, the objective here is just to prove that something exists that is uncaused and self-sufficient. That's it. That's what the infinite regress argument is employed for here. But fact of the matter is that not a single atheist thinks otherwise. Not a single atheist. On naturalism, nature itself is self-sufficient, and that's that. He quoted as much when he quoted someone holding Adamson, I remember, holding with the clock example, that if indeed worldly things are all caused, then it doesn't follow that the world itself must be caused. That, he claimed, is a fallacy of composition. And apparently, you have no problem with that, Brother Hijab. So what is the fuss about anyway? What is the fuss about? What is it all about? What religion are you really trying to get people to embrace? Notice how he fails at even holding the infinite regress as a sufficient argument, as he goes on to ask, so what is that regress dependent on? Oh, seriously? An infinite regress is an impossible assumption. Okay, an assumption of meaning that is impossible. It cannot exist in reality, let alone depend on anything for its existence in reality. It only exists, okay, as an assumption in your mind. But no surprise there, brothers and sisters. That's what the Greek tradition of debate drags you into inevitably and invariably. You can easily commit a fallacy of projection without even noticing it. You keep committing ridiculous fallacies at every corner. Okay? There really is no weight or worth then for his declaration when he adds the major point of disagreement relates to what the independent being is. Oh, really? You think? How could you have missed that? How could we have missed that, brothers and sisters? فعلا بجد يا خبر أبيض. الله المستعان. He goes on to say, one can argue that anything composed of attachable parts is dependent, and since the universe is composed in this way, therefore the universe is dependent. The same thing can be said about an infinite multiverse. Now, this is an entirely different argument from Ibn Sina's, as he furnished earlier, brothers and sisters. Notice the trickery here. Okay, of course, anything that is composed of detachable parts is dependent on whoever it was that brought it together or composed it, as it were. So if this is your first premise, then your second premise would naturally be the claim that the world at large, not to mention the so-called multiverse, is in fact all composed in its entirety of attachable parts. Okay, but according to the tradition you've committed yourself to, this is not self-evident. You will need to prove it first. So how can you go on doing that? How can you prove it? Induction? Obviously, we're only ever seen a small part of this world, and despite what the mutakallimun would claim, it's not necessarily true or self-evident that any creature which is the subject of your proof, not anything that came to be after it was non-existent, after its own existence, its own inexistence or non-existence, is such a general connotation, must have come into being by composing it from previously separate or detachable parts. As a matter of fact, only those things that we humans create can be told to come into existence in this way through experience. Okay, this is how we build things together. And not all things that we build, by the way, mind you, okay, some of our constructions and things that we build, are made by subtracting parts from a previously existing mass, okay, not by adding to it, as is the case of sculpting a monument, for example. Some other human products are made by transformation. We alter the physical composition of something under an effect that cannot be described as composing previously detached parts. Okay, or bringing them together, as in freezing a cup of water, for instance, okay, or melting a piece of iron. So if indeed, even in your own limited experience, not all things are created by composition of previously detached parts, how can you possibly know that every created thing in the universe must have been made in this way? Truth of the matter, brothers and sisters, we cannot. We cannot. There's simply no way of knowing that. And as Ibn Taymiyyah rahimahullah elaborated, we need not know that. Okay, a single observation of one single thing coming into being after its own nothingness is enough as an ayah, okay, alama, or a reminder of the fact that our Maker exists, the fact that we already know in our fitrah exists, and that He deserves all due worship and submission. But because the Greek tradition is founded on the sophist claim that this is not sufficient epistemically, and there needs to be a logical argument based on premises that imply that all things of the world are indeed created, the mutakallimun found no choice but to resort to the Greek tradition of metaphysical theory. Okay, something is X because it is composed of A and B by virtue of its very existence itself. If anything at all exists that merits falling under the meaning X, whatever that is, then it has to be as such as the theory claims. In that way, all they need to do next is observe but a few things that have been composed from detachable parts, so they can take the leap of saying all things that come to be after their non-existence must have been composed from detachable parts. How do they know that? Okay, how do they know it? By merit of the very meaning of the word come to be, or came to be, huduth in linguistic use, they claim. It must be redefined, okay, which is what we call the metaphysical definition, such that you cannot use it in any context without actually meaning or implying this nature or constitution or reality or the howness or whatness, al-kayfiyya yani, to use a familiar jargon yani. And so, the claimed method of composition becomes the ultimate explanation for the existence of anything at all that can be said to have started to exist after its own nothingness. Okay, you do that, and it's not long before you realize that if you were to ascribe the meaning of doing something, anything, or saying anything, or acting in any way to your Lord subhanahu wa ta'ala, then you would be automatically, by necessity of the theory, reducing him to a creature. Why? Because only creatures start to exist after the nothingness. And if a divine deed is indeed something that starts after its own non-existence, he starts doing something after he was not doing it, then the deed itself can only be a composed creature according to the theory, which is precisely why the Mu'tazila insisted that his deeds are actually nothing but the things that he creates. Okay, his self thereto is not to be described as actually having turned into a condition or a state that is any different from the one it was in from eternity by doing something, by resorting to performing something, or else that change itself would make him a composed thing according to the theory. So what should we do? Refrain from coming up with first principles of existence that are actually nothing but baseless deformations of linguistic use under the tag of philosophical or kalami definitions and outrageous reductions of the reality of different types of existing things that can all merit the general meaning we seek to define without necessarily being analogous to anything we have ever witnessed in our human experience in their nature or in their being. Okay, quit this sophist, outrageous Greek tradition of making claims about all of reality in terms of nature and constitution, and you will see that the right way of the prophets and their followers is to refute and ridicule the false belief by outlining its false entailments, okay, putting them forth, leaving the opponent no choice but to move out of it all to the clear truth. It is not to construct the belief of the existence of some abstract maker on grounds of a deductive argument, قياس شمول from first principles. No, you will never do that without reducing your creator by necessity either to yet another creature, and وتشبيه الأفعال بقى كذلك, as the pantheists would end up doing at an extreme end of that approach, or to an entity that only exists in your mind as the deist would at the extreme end of تعطيل يعني. There is no way that such a method of metaphysical theory would yield a belief in the Lord that we Muslims worship, and it's due time that followers of this man were made to see that. May Allah grant guidance and deliverance to all those who truly seek it. Wallahu musta'an wa la hawla